Piers Morgan. That's almost as posh and middle class as Newton Dunn.
Yeah, I don't know how you got the Newton Dunn, but in my family, it was when a Pugh married a Morgan, and there was a battle royal over who would give up what name, and they decided neither would.
Same with us. I think Piers is posher than Tom, though. You definitely win on that. But look, the serious point, you grew up in a lovely part of leafy East Sussex. You were sent to a private prep school. Your first job was in insurance, working for Lloyd's of London. I bet that's a fact not many people know. And, of course, your brother's an army officer.
You missed out my man of the people credentials. I did go to a prep school until I was 13, but then I went into the comprehensive system for the next 5 years. So I do think that's quite a significant part of my upbringing, because I was able to sample both sides of the educational divide, and I think you either end up with a chip on both shoulders or quite a well-rounded view of almost everybody you meet. So that was, it was a slightly more complex education than the posh theme that you were trying to force through there, Tom.
Yes, I had a feeling you were going to pick me up on that. All in, though, if you take out the comprehensive, which you've just explained well, it's a reasonably classic sort of Tory middle-class upbringing, wasn't it?
Reasonably. I mean, I came from an East Sussex village, very small, little place called Fletching. I went to the local school. Then we moved to the neighbouring village of Newark. Broadly, I would say pretty conservative. You wouldn't meet many Labour voters down there in the pub of a Saturday night. We weren't a wealthy family, but we weren't a poor family. We sort of, muddled on by. My parents worked very, very hard running a country pub until I was into my teens. So, yeah, I mean, it was a very nice, safe, stable upbringing in a pretty nice, safe, stable, predominantly conservative area.
So when did you first become aware of politics in itself, or politicians per se? Do you remember?
Maggie Thatcher, because she was the first prime minister where I could legally vote, which I did for her, in fact. And I actually, when I was at Lewis Priory Sixth Form College, I took part in a CND debate about nuclear weapons, and I won it. And I was supporting the resolution that they're an essential force for good in terms of defending a country, to have a successful nuclear deterrent. And I actually wrote to Margaret Thatcher and told her about my thrilling win, which had enraged all the wokies, and they existed even then, in my sixth form common room. And she wrote back and sent me a signed picture. And I've actually got the letter from her congratulating me on my triumphant debate win. The irony now that the current Conservative Prime Minister and his entire cabinet refused to talk to me. But Maggie was thrilled to hear my news and to hear that she'd inspired me.
And she signed the letter. It was all really her.
Yeah, all from her, signed by her, and it was very nice. And I've always basically voted more for personalities than parties, because I believe personalities, if they're strong enough, they shape party and they shape policy, and if they win, they shape government.
Let's move on to your working life in journalism then. You abandoned insurance reasonably quickly, it would appear, and became a journalist.
Well, I stumbled into insurance purely by chance. I don't want anyone listening thinking I actively pursued a career in insurance. So I always wanted to be a journalist. And then a friend of mine worked at Lloyd's of London in the great insurance room, and somebody broke their leg on his underwriting syndicate. So there was a slot which I filled. And it's quite interesting because I earned a lot of money. This is in my late teens, and I earned a lot of money, but was bored out of my brains. And the real calculation then was, do you pursue your passion, which in my case was journalism, or do you pursue hard, filthy lucre and accept you're just going to be bored for the rest of your life? And I'm very, very glad that I took the former option.
Well, you swiftly made your way onto The Sun. Obviously, your career is well documented since then. You then went on to edit the News of the World and edited the Daily Mirror. All those papers, though, pretty different political beasts, certainly The Sun versus the Mirror. How did your voting go when you were doing your changes? Did you always vote with the paper's line? Did working on those different papers, very different papers, influence the way you thought personally?
No, not really. I didn't. I've always seen myself as a journalist, and I'm not sure journalists should be too partisan politically. Just generally, and I think it's a sadness these days. It's very hard to find journalists whose political opinions you're not immediately aware of from the way they tweet or speak or do pieces to camera. I think it's a problem in society, because really most journalists should try and be politically impartial. I've always tried to be that in terms of my broadcasting. I would defy anyone if I didn't actually actively tell them how I would vote. I sort of think of staying on everybody's houses and give them all equally a hard time. But I think in terms of the papers, I mean, you say the Mirror and the Sun were very different, but of course the Sun, in the mid-90s, switched to vote for Tony Blair, who I voted for, and I was editor of the Mirror. There was not much of a fag paper between the two papers at the time in terms of their political allegiance.
Okay, it would be an interesting situation, though, isn't it? When you're editing these papers, your leader columns are may or may not have any influence from proprietors, thundering down the leader column saying, you must do this today, you must vote for this man today, and then you're just crossing a different box. Did that ever happen?
Well, I never had that from anyone, including Rupert Murdoch. I mean, I edited the News of the World for him for 2 years. He never told me directly what to put in the paper ever about anything, nor did he ever direct me politically to take a particular line. I think it might be a different relationship he has with the Sun, and that is certainly more of his mouthpiece politically. But certainly my experience was nothing like the caricature of him barking instructions about who you should be positioning the paper to support. But he gave me a remarkably free rein in that regard. So, other editors may have had different experiences. I can only gauge it on mine. So I'm just trying to think whether I've ever actively voted against what the paper I was editing was doing. I don't think so, because when I went to the Mirror, I voted for Blair. Went to the Mirror in 95, voted for Blair. I voted for him twice. I didn't vote for him after the Iraq War because I found that unconscionable. And so no, I never had a situation when I was editing a paper where I personally would have voted a different way to the way the paper was leading the readers.
So you became the editor of the News of the World, aged 29, youngish national newspaper editor in half a century. I think I should point that out quickly before you were inevitably going to. Becoming editor of a big newspaper like that, aged so young, it gave you immediate access to very senior politicians. I know the game myself. I was a political editor for many years. I know how senior politicians love to court newspaper editors. I had to set up a fair few lunches in my time. But did you enjoy that, the whining and dining and being able to bend the ear of power so personally?
Yeah, I did. I mean, it was extraordinary, the access I got. I mean, when I did a book called The Insider, which were diaries of my editing years at the Mirror, I actually counted from my diaries, which I kept, on my schedules. I had 56 one-on-one meetings with Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister in Downing Street. And I mean, at least another 100 meetings with him outside of Downing Street in groups of more than just me and him. And some would be in his office, some would be in his flat, wherever, cabinet office, whatever, the garden. And that's an extraordinary amount of time. And it shows you also, I think, how determined Blair was to try and mold the media to be on side with him. And, we were broadly in line with a lot of what he was doing until the Iraq War. And then we had a spectacular disagreement of opinion. I fought a big campaign to, as you know, because you were there for some of it, to stop the Iraq War happening. And I feel very sad to this day that we were unsuccessful.
But on that actual process of a Prime Minister giving a newspaper editor so much airtime, and absolutely you had a lot of readers at the time, so perhaps he wants to talk directly to those readers. But, there are captains of industry he could have been spending his time with. I bet he didn't meet them 150 times in your, 8 years of editor of the Daily Mirror. Did you feel throughout this, Blair or Gordon Brown, whoever else it was, were they paying you too much attention, as flashing as it might have been?
I mean, possibly, you could argue that. I used to find when I went round there that they were both, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they were really as much pumping me for information about what our readers were really caring about and what our readers' mailbag was saying and what were the issues really driving them. Plus, they wanted to try and shape, how we would cover what they were doing. Plus, I think also it's quite a lonely job being Prime Minister or Chancellor, and I think I got on quite well with both of them, and we'd have a glass of wine or a pint or whatever it may be. I mean, I remember Blair used to like drinking pints of foaming ale out of silver tankers, which was always a bit Alan Partridge, but I used to quite enjoy it. And I think that if you get on with them, an editor, I guess, is somebody that you feel you can confide in the moment, and it must be quite hard if you're Prime Minister as to who you can talk to, where you can have a modicum of trust.
Sorry, a modicum of trust with a popular newspaper editor. That's a slight contradiction in terms, isn't it? You go and tell your political editor, write it.
Well, it sounds weird, but a lot of political editors I know, they do actually, they do have good relationships with people if it's built around that trust, where you can speak frankly, but then have a different position when you're actually talking about stories for the paper. And you have to respect, I think, all contacts for newspapers. I always found it laughable when journalists would say to me, "Oh, you can't ever suppress a story or anything else if you know somebody or friends." Well, of course you can. You just do a deal. We used to do that all the time. Every journalist I know does that. It's a total fallacy, in my opinion, to not build up a contact, a relationship, where you weigh up the odds of a certain story against potentially a bigger one, or ruining a relationship for a medium-sized story when there might be a much bigger one down the line. So it's constant deal making if you're a good journalist about good contacts. And I would say prime ministers and editors is a perfect example of that. I mean, most editors who write memoirs will tell the same kind of pattern, where they have a lot of contact with the prime minister of the day, and most of it is off the record and not for publication.
So who was the leader's company you most enjoyed when you're sitting back with that tankard of beer in a silver cup or whatever it was, or Gordon Brown's red wine? Whose personal company were you most happy with?
Well, until this year, always had a great time with Donald Trump, funny enough. So in America, I'd say Trump, Bill Clinton. Over here, I liked hanging out with Tony Blair. I still speak to him occasionally. I go see him, and we chew the fat. And I think we got a good, much warmer relationship now than we had around the time of the Iraq War, certainly.
You still see him now, after all the abuse you gave him over Iraq and all that bad blood?
Yeah, which I think says a lot about him. If I had a moment when I was at CNN and I was going to go and interview Netanyahu in Israel, and the first time I'd ever been there, and I thought, who do I know who can give me a quick sort of recce of the land and how it's all lying over there, and who knows everybody. And I thought, well, Tony Blair. So I emailed him and asked if he would mind just giving me a little bit of background. And he rang and gave me an hour-long sort of summary of where everything was in the Middle East and with Israel and Palestine and so on. It was incredibly useful and very kind of him. So, I sort of talk about this in my book, is I don't think this tribalism we're now getting into, where you have to be implacably for or oppose something or somebody, is helpful. I've always preferred to have a critical, friendly relationship with world leaders or politicians or celebrities or whoever it may be, where I hope that you can be quite critical and then you go away and have a drink and you remain on friendly terms. I don't know why it can't always be like that, with very few exceptions.
Well, let's talk a bit about that, because some may look at your interviewing style on Good Morning Britain and the very robust experiences politicians have with you when they come on. Some would say is you being tribal and struggle a little bit with just perhaps the sheer aggression you use sometimes on politicians. Do they have any sense of righteousness about that? Do you go over the top sometimes?
I mean, probably, yeah. I mean, it got very volatile in March, April, but let's put it into context. We were suffering some catastrophic death toll figures and the appalling economic fallout that came from that as well. But on the death toll, we were losing hundreds of health and care workers who were not properly protected. I personally knew a number of people whose parents died of COVID, including a cousin. Kate Garraway, my co-presenter on Good Morning Britain, her husband was very nearly died, just still in a coma today, and so I felt a very personal sense of sort of passionate anger about what was happening, and about, in my estimation, the utter incompetence of the government and its appalling failure to handle the pandemic properly, quickly enough. So I came at it from that position. So I don't really make any apology. If I went a little bit too hard on these poor little ministers, well, diddy dum-dums, their decision-making was costing lives. It was time to take the gloves off. I would say there is a greater responsibility for those who give them too easy a time. And there's quite a lot of that going on now, given all the cabinet refuses to go on our show, Channel 4 News and Newsnight. I mean, you can do the maths about what shows they're avoiding. And I think it's incumbent on those who are getting the access to hold their feet to the fire properly. And at the moment, it's all a little bit too cozy.
So how long has it been since they've come on Good Morning Britain, government ministers? 150 days and counting?
No, it's nearly 180 now.
180. And have they actually sat you down and told you why? Number 10 ever rang you up and explained the boycott?
No, but there is a wonderful irony because the person who's leading it is Lee Kane, the director of communications at Downing Street, who in his previous incarnation was a Daily Mirror journalist whose job at one stage was to dress up as a giant yellow chicken and run around literally after top Tory politicians and harangue them in the street on camera for ducking TV debates. I mean, the irony is almost breathtaking. So there's this guy who was leading the charge for freedom of speech and demanding that Tory politicians be held accountable for their actions from David Cameron down. And now he is the one, along with Boris Johnson, driving the censorship and boycott of our show and two other shows where they may not get such an easy time. And I think it's a pathetic dereliction of their duty, frankly.
So, not for me to put their case, but they would say, you're rude, you're hectoring, you don't let them have their say or put their case. But that's not right. It's all fair game once the cameras are rolling, is it?
Yeah, I mean, we give lots of people a hard time. Giving Keir Starmer a hard time. Nicola Sturgeon regularly we've given a hard time to. They keep coming back. Jonathan Ashworth, we've buried him a few times. He comes back. If you can't handle a tough interview in the middle of a pandemic, where your decision-making is costing thousands and tens of thousands of lives, why should we trust you to run a country? I mean, surely it's not beyond them to come on and face a tough grilling. Because if it is, they're in the wrong job.
Okay, let's talk about let's go over the pond. Let's talk about Donald Trump a tiny bit. You mentioned him. In the past, you've called him a friend, haven't you? Perhaps even a good friend. You first met on Celebrity Apprentice in the States, about 2008?
Yeah, I took part in that first series of the celebrity version out there. He was the host, obviously, and I ended up winning it. So I spent about 6 weeks opposite him in a boardroom for hours on end every night and got to know him quite well. And then after that, I went back in each year as one of his boardroom advisors for a few challenges each series. And then I went to CNN and I interviewed him probably 35, 40 times at CNN. And by then we were in a relationship where he would just ring me up for a chat and we'd chew the fat about life probably every 3 weeks or so. And that went on for a few years. So when he suddenly became president of the United States, or actually when he ran for president of the United States, obviously it was a weird position to find myself where somebody I considered genuinely a quite good friend. He'd been incredibly loyal to me, especially when I left CNN, one of the very few people to stay in touch and to regularly contact me and check how I was doing and could he help and so on. And I'd take people as I find them. I like Trump. I still like him in many ways. He's a very different kind of political animal. He's bombastic, he's polarizing, he's combative, he can be very funny, he can be appalling. He can be all those things. We've never seen anyone quite like him, and I doubt we will again. And there's no room in the modern society for nuance about Trump. You have to either love him blindly or hate him blindly. I prefer to be somewhere in the middle. So I don't know if we've really fallen out. I had an exchange with him the other day via a third party at the White House, and it was pretty civilized. So I think he's fine. He just doesn't want to follow me on Twitter when I'm hammering him every day.
How did your exchange with the third party go? What did you discuss?
I sent an email to somebody pretty adjacent to the Oval Office just saying, please tell POTUS that I found his Prince Harry joke very funny when he said Harry's going to need good luck. Well, he said, I want to wish good luck to Prince Harry with regard to Meghan Markle because he's going to need it. And I thought the comic timing of because he's going to need it was most amusing. So I said it made me laugh out loud. And I got a note back saying he just read your note and laughed out loud. So I think there's room for rapprochement.
Sounds like it's thawing already. Morgan Trump loving is back on. You're not by a chance positioning yourself for the first post-presidential interview with the what might soon be ex-President Trump, are you?
Or perish the thought.
Perish the thought. Okay, you say you're an American citizen, you've got to vote. You've been bitterly critical of Donald Trump over the last 6 months or so, largely because of the way he's handling the pandemic. What would you do with that vote? Would you vote for Trump or Biden?
Well, I've always been careful not to say how I would vote in the US election. I never have done before. I didn't last time with Trump. All I kept saying was I think he's going to win. It was more of a prediction than what I personally wanted. I've always said as well, I personally wouldn't vote for Trump because I'm not a Republican. But it's not my right anyway. I'm not an American. I have no vote there. It's down to Americans how to vote. I just simply would say this time, I think he has a very, very, very small chance of getting re-elected, but it's not impossible. We know with Trump that he's very unpredictable as a candidate. A lot of people may not show up in the polls who then go and vote for him. I get a sense America's got a bit tired and fed up with the Trump circus, and I think the pandemic has been such a disaster in America and the death toll so spectacularly big and horrendous that I find it very hard to believe he'll get re-elected, given the state of the economy and the number of people who died and the general chaos. But I always have said never bet against Trump, and 2 weeks in American politics right now is a long time. So I think it's heading towards a Biden victory, but we all thought that about Hillary last time.
Okay, so you don't have a vote. You're not a US citizen. You are a citizen of the world. Donald Trump's actions have global repercussions. As a human being, do you want him to get re-elected as president?
I don't think it matters what I want or whether I.
But I am asking.
Well, the question I might be better equipped to answer is, does he deserve to be? And I would say on the first 3 years of his tenure, you could certainly build a picture of Trump doing actually not badly. If you take away the tweeting and the rhetoric, which can be very inflammatory and often ridiculous, and obviously I'm aware you can't take it away. It's all part of the package. But if you take that away, focus on what he actually did. He got the economy in very good shape, continue where Obama had left off and improve things. That was a big tick. He didn't go to war anywhere, which no liberal ever gives him any credit for, but I think is worthy of putting on the record. He took out some very bad people, Baghdadi, leader of ISIS, Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian military. He did a lot of stuff. He did a lot of interesting stuff with things like criminal justice, which he doesn't get any credit for, which I think are worthy of putting on his record. So I would have said, as I say in my book, come the end of January, I thought he was heading for a very comfortable re-election. But, events, dear boy, events. And the pandemic, unfortunately, has exposed a lot of Trump's worst character flaws, not least trying to make it all about him and lacking any real empathy for what people were going through. You can bluster and blather and tell downright lies and try and distract and everything else, but the virus doesn't want to hear you. It can't hear you. And I think there's a cold, hard reality for a lot of populist leaders that rhetoric gets you nowhere in a pandemic. And the fact that you want somebody like Angela Merkel or Jacinda Ardern, who have come at this in a much more serious way from the very start and been very firmly decisive in their actions and have reaped the benefit of having a far better handling the pandemic than either Trump or Boris.
Okay, let's get back over to this side of the pond then. So let's fast forward. 2019 general election. How did you vote? Who did you vote for then?
I voted for Boris Johnson in last December, because as a Remainer, I felt very angry that my fellow Remainers, the Ramona end of the spectrum, were simply refusing to accept the result of a democratic referendum. And I value democracy over any party allegiance. And so I voted for the Conservatives purely on the fact that Boris Johnson was the only leader prepared to deliver the result of a referendum in which I had voted for the losing side, which I think probably shows how fair-minded I am when it comes to my politics.
And how possibly almost unique you are as well in terms of the way you choose what cross you're going to cross.
Yeah, well, I couldn't in all conscience vote for Jeremy Corbyn. So had they had a very different candidate running the Labour Party who was prepared to say that they would deliver the result of the referendum, as Keir Starmer now says he is, I think if they'd had enough people at the top saying that before, I might have voted differently. But I couldn't vote for a party that was implacably opposed to defying the will of 17.5 million people, even though I was one of the people who voted the other way.
And the classic pollster's question, how would you vote if there was a general election tomorrow?
Well, I certainly wouldn't vote for Boris Johnson. I think he's finished as a leader of any credibility in this country. He may stagger on for a bit. I'd be stunned if he fights the next election. I think we're heading for a very turbulent and very difficult few years, and he's woefully ill-equipped to deal with it. His kind of cheery bluster just doesn't cut the ice with me in such a situation like this. And we need, I'm afraid we just need better leadership. So I would be surprised, frankly, if someone like Rishi Sunak is not the Tory leader within a year.
So that vote tomorrow sounds like I have to go to Keir Starmer. or the Lib Dems?
I think if it was held tomorrow, I'd probably vote for Keir Starmer on the basis that I think he's brought a more serious side to the Labour Party, a more electable side. I think he's quite a likable guy. I've interviewed him. I think he's serious-minded, and I think he wants to, run the party properly. And certainly, he's a better option right now, I would think, than someone like Boris Johnson, who even Boris fans are turning on him. The sort of previously pro-Boris Spectator and Telegraph, and they've been hammering the guy because they can see, as we all can, he's just completely out of his depth.
And just to be clear, none of this has any reflection on who does or doesn't want to come on your show in the morning. This is you talking, not the frustrated TV presenter.
No, I think the honest answer is, of course, the way you are personally treated by somebody is going to have an effect. Whether it's Meghan Markle ghosting me, which I just thought was pathetic when she met Harry, or whether it's Boris Johnson, who I've known 30 years and always got on very well with, turning out to be a total disaster, or whether it's Trump, who, again, on the pandemic has been a disaster. I look at how people do it. If Boris wants to boycott me and have his entire cabinet boycott me, it's hardly going to endear me to him. It's not going to win my vote. So I think the award for the bleeding obvious is to the question, would I vote for Boris Johnson? I can't even get to interview him, let alone vote for him.
The one question you would put to him then, if you could get it in front of you, he appeared, Piers, I'm coming on your show tomorrow. What's the one thing you really want to know? I
think I would just say, you don't want to do this, do you? It'd be more of a statement. It would be like, this is not what you thought it would be. You thought you were going to inherit a nice rosy garden with a big majority where you were going to deliver Brexit and be a national hero. And in fact, you're a national fiasco. Brexit's sort of irrelevant now in the general scheme of economic mayhem. You can't deliver on any of your promises. And on the pandemic, you've been a total disaster. So at that stage, I'd probably say, should we just pack your bags, Prime Minister?
I suspect he's not going to be coming on anytime soon like that, but you probably knew that anyway. We're coming to them, Piers. I have to try and define your politics now. Tricky thing to do because your politics aren't uncomplicated. So I'm going to have a go at pinning you down as an unpredictable, outspoken, personality-driven floating voter.
Yes, I think I would subscribe to that. Yeah, you got to win my vote. And the people that win my vote tend to be forceful personalities who know how to lead a country. And if you've ticked those boxes, I'm in.
Piers Morgan, thank you for joining us on Personality Politics.
Cheers, Tom.